called On Public Policy to Support Landscape Partnerships, Strategic Government Actions to Scale Local Solutions for Drought and Landscape Restoration. We will have a presentation on the public policy issues. Tom there will present the findings of a paper that has been put together on guiding landscape partnerships and governments to do these kinds of things. And then we'll have a small panel for colleagues to share experiences and guidance on how landscape level partnerships can be supported to be able to realize their visions at the landscape level. So since there's not many of us, Tom, you want us to do a quick round of introductions. I'll start with you, Marie-Laure, and you can parler en français. Hein?
Merci, Pémo. Je suis Marie-Laure Pegniemet. Je travaille pour le PNUD au niveau du programme de microfinancement du Fonds pour l'environnement mondial. Donc, je suis conseiller technique en matière de gestion durable des terres, en matière de lutte contre la dégradation des terres. Donc, le programme de microfinancement du FEM, il couvre à peu près 130 pays à travers le monde. Ça, c'est en Afrique, en Amérique latine et dans les Caraïbes, mais également en Asie-Pacifique, les petits États insulaires et également une partie de l'Europe de l'Est. Et c'est un plaisir pour moi de partager avec vous ce que nous faisons dans le cadre des paysages, landscape and seascape. Je vous remercie.
Merci, Marie-Laure.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mika Born Ochieng. I work at C4ECRAF, based in Nairobi, and I work primarily around stakeholder engagement with evidence, particularly looking at where science, practice, and policy meet, and also leading a restoration program called Regreening Africa, and I'll be coming back later. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Cohen. I work with a group called ACDI VOCA with headquarters in Washington, D.C. ACDI VOCA is an almost 60-year-old NGO that focuses on agricultural development, rural development in Africa mainly, but we also have programs in Latin America and Asia. And I'm responsible for the environmental climate change piece, and under that is included landscape level approaches. Thank you.
Good morning, all. My name is Patrick Esede. I work for the National Agency for the Great Green Wall in Nigeria. At the agency, we look at issues of land degradation, drought. We also try as much as possible to enhance livelihood, green economy, and all issues that will bring back food security and food sufficiency for our local people. Thank you. This is my first time of coming under this platform, and I hope I will really have some take home. Thank you for allowing me to this forum. Thank you.
Hi, my name is William Maye. I am from Ivory Coast. I am working for the Ministry of Agriculture. Our department is in charge of issues related to environment and technical issues related to agriculture. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm Louise Baker. I'm the Managing Director of the Global Mechanism at UNCCD. Nice to see everybody.
Morning, everyone. My name is Michael Orangi. I work for Rainforest Alliance as Director, Kenya and Tanzania. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Nanga Kone. I am the Country Director of Rainforest Alliance, Côte d'Ivoire. It's a pleasure to be here. For those who don't know Rainforest Alliance, it is a non-for-profit organization that work around the world to combat climate change, protect forest and biodiversity, promote human rights, and improve livelihoods. Nice to meet you all. Thanks.
Bonjour, messieurs, dames. Je suis Yaya Fofana. Je travaille au ministère de la Communication et de l'économie numérique de Côte d'Ivoire. Merci.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Happy good morning to all of you. I'm Dr. Ian Dharmendra from India, representing an NGO. And if you look into our organization, we are working into agroecology. We are also a partner of EcoAgriculture. Looking at the topic, out of my interest and curiosity, I'm here. Looking forward for the discussion that will be happening here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Bonjour, very happy to be here. I'm Bob Tansey from the Nature Conservancy, and I'm our Global Policy Lead for Degraded Lands and Restoration. Thank you for the program.
Good morning, everybody. Bonjour. My name is Mike Keller. I am the communications lead for 1,000 Landscapes for a Billion People and the senior communications manager for EcoAgriculture Partners.
Thank you, everybody. You can hear me? Yeah? Yeah? I think it's on. Okay, thank you very much for introducing yourselves and welcome again. So, why are we interested in policy issues related to landscape management and landscape partnerships? Well, first of all, policies can make or break action at the landscape level. The ownership and control and access to land and natural resources is shaped by many things, including institutions at the local level, but also at the very top of the policy-making space. So today we will look at the kind of enabling actions that governments can put in place to facilitate or to promote landscape-level partnerships and for them to be effective. And what do we mean by landscape partnerships? This could be multi-stakeholder partnerships of any sort. They take many forms. Some of them could be quite formal, some of them could be very informal, but the idea is that people come together to agree on how to manage landscapes that they live in and utilize natural resources in and get their living out of through the access to and control and utilization of natural resources. So they face all sorts of challenges, as you can imagine. Some of the community level organizations, they have, they lack access to finance, they lack access to control, legal control and ownership of resources. So today we'll look at some of the ideas that researchers have come up with. Researchers within the 1,000 Landscapes Partnership have put together a paper to try and understand how or guide policy makers on how to facilitate effective landscape partnerships. Why are we interested in this as UNDP? Obviously, our role is to support governments to make these things work at the country level. So for us as a development agency, natural resource management and access to natural resources and control over them for livelihoods, for sustainable livelihoods, is part of what we do as a development agency of the UN. And a convention like the UNCCD has, member states have signed up to it, and they want to work with countries and communities to address and combat degradation of landscapes and address drought. So our role is to support that process, and governance and participatory decision making and governance is a key part of tackling this problem. So without much ado, I will hand over to Tom to speak to us through this paper that has been put together, and then we can go into a discussion after that. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Pemo. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Pemo for the warm welcome. We really value UNDP's participation in the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative. Pemo on the steering committee in particular has been a big help in helping to organize this event. My name is Tom Durr. I'm the program coordinator for the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative for EcoAgriculture Partners, which is, along with Rainforest Alliance, one of the primary convening organizations of the 1,000 Landscapes initiative. The main reason we're here today is actually to talk about a public policy paper that's been put together by some various partners of 1,000 Landscapes and others, but a quick plug for the event directly following this one in Met 14. Are we in 12 or 14 now? 14. So in Met 12, or it's in 14? We're in 14, okay. So the 1,000 Landscapes event following this will be at 11:30 in Met 12. We hope to see you there. To get into this paper a little bit though, the authors of this paper were a collaboration by EcoAgriculture Partners, Columbia University, Cornell University, and the Gallup Initiative, which is the Global Livelihoods and Landscape Recovery Program. Those are really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the people who contributed to the paper, and I'll get more into that in a little bit. But I'll give a brief introduction to the paper before we actually then dive into some dialogue, and a big thank you to our panelists just in advance. But this is really the question that we want to explore in this session today. Why is policy critical to landscape and seascape partnership success? As Pemmo kind of laid out, we all, as many of us have been here at the COP for about a week now, I hope have heard a lot about landscapes and the increasing movement to move more towards thinking at the landscape level and the landscape scale. But when we actually think about the action that's required to do that, one of the primary mechanisms for doing so is operating through landscape partnerships, which Pemmo laid out as multi-stakeholder coalitions of actors within the landscape, working at the territory, jurisdictional, watershed, landscape, seascape level, whatever it is that you refer or call landscapes. So the folks who are interested with the work of EcoAgriculture Partners, or many of our partners are probably familiar with this diagram, in that the alignment of people and nature is quite critical to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We're very focused on the SDGs and believe that to actually achieve the SDGs, you need to apply them in a particular place. So the SDGs are, in other words, place specific, and the integration of those SDGs is really, really important. And the policy levers to make that happen and create that enabling and empowering environment are quite critical if we're going to achieve them. So, this was the question that the authors of the policy brief really sought to answer. What national policies and programs can most effectively support landscape and seascape partnerships to deliver benefits across the Sustainable Development Goals? To answer this question, or even just start the conversation on it, they pulled from a lot of existing literature, including GIZ's approaches to sustainable development study. They pulled a lot through consultations and interviews with 15 experts working in different spaces, from organizations such as those represented here, and also from direct recommendations from landscape leaders through various convenings like FAO and EcoAg's roundtable events, the African Landscape Action Plan, and the Mesoamerican Landscape Dialogue. And the purpose of this was really to integrate and incorporate the learnings from these various actors directly into this report. So this is just a snapshot of some of the experiences consulted. I won't get into all of this, but it was quite a diverse group. We felt that this was really important, that we were collecting the diversity of perspectives within this report, recognizing that landscape partnerships, while they do face similar challenges, are all very context specific. So policy recommendations for them need to be adaptable and applied to that specific context, which of course has its big challenges when operating on a global scale. In terms of the landscape and seascape partnerships that we drew experiences from, this is just another snapshot. Apologies for the small print, but hopefully you can see on the map. We had a big focus on Central and Latin America, where we pulled a lot from indigenous communities operating in that space and how indigenous perspectives are built into landscape partnerships. We also pulled from a few case studies in Europe, Africa, Asia and Oceania in particular, and in total really harvested learnings from about 18 different landscape partnerships. So through these consultations, what we tried to do is synthesize the lessons learned and identify the types of support needed by landscape partnerships. And we really found 4 primary things that we wanted to focus on as recommendations. And a lot of this perhaps isn't very surprising. A lot of this has already been talked about at many of the events that have been going on here at the COP. But supportive government policy is quite important in terms of empowering and creating the enabling environment for landscape partnerships to achieve whatever it is that they want to achieve as their own sort of landscape action plans and landscape goals. Cross-sectoral policy, multi-level governance and distributed authority is quite important. When thinking about integrated landscape management, having that shared understanding and distributed leadership is quite important. Having that multi-stakeholder coalition active and empowered to actually not just take a whole of government approach, but a whole of society approach is one way we can actually integrate the ways we think about supportive government policies into a broader sort of inclusive mindset rather than having top-down agendas that aren't always the most inclusive or the most effective in enabling local level action. Technical services and local capacity development. This is really what 1,000 Landscapes for 1 billion people is focused on doing, is connecting the people who have been working on these ideas and topics for a long time, whether it be in a specific discipline or community or practice, people who have been working on landscape approaches and inclusive governance models for a long time, and then integrating all these together. So in other words, understanding the different capacity development needs that landscape partnerships have, the different financing needs they have, and all the different sort of tools and services that create that space for landscape partnerships to come together, convene, and influence from a bottom-up sort of way government policies. Financial and business services are quite interesting. We're finding, of course, that more and more funding is being put towards local level sustainable development type projects, and making the best use of those funds will be critical in the coming decades. So how can we actually stop thinking about project-specific, siloed, sectoral projects and think about how we want to fund integrated landscape action plans? So how do we recognize the synergies between the various projects happening at the landscape level and really create a new paradigm for market development in terms of long-term generational support for landscape partnerships? I think one of the things that has come up quite a bit throughout this COP is the need for funding, long-term funding for coordination and convening. In other words, even when funds do go to landscape-specific projects, they tend to fail because they lack synergies, they can't avoid trade-offs, they really lack the coordination function. So working at the landscape level, and I think what a lot of the authors of this report found, is that landscape partnerships, to be successful, actually need to have certain individuals, people, organizations who are dedicated in the long term to ensuring that the coordination and convening functions of a landscape partnership are actually taking place. So that's a major funding need of landscape partnerships that has traditionally been lacking from the space. And then the last point here is, how do we connect landscape partnerships and the service providers that are there to help them out? And how, more importantly, can we connect landscape partnerships with other landscape partnerships? One of the things that we see being really valuable is demonstrating to other landscape partnerships and also demonstrating to people in the space that this is an approach that is actually worth investing in, that is worth promoting, that it's not a niche sort of subject, that it's been happening at the landscape level for a long time. And one of the reasons it hasn't effectively scaled is because top-down sort of actors haven't recognized their potential and therefore haven't invested in it. So if we can find ways to really elevate through convenings and shared learnings, dialogues with government institutions in spaces like this, in the field, wherever it might be, that landscape partnerships are probably our best solution to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in an effective and efficient way is quite powerful. So having these convenings, having these dialogues, and really demonstrating ways that can socialize and normalize and institutionalize landscape level approaches will be really important in the coming decades so that we can actually create the policy change that we want to see. So, ingredients for successful external support of landscape partnerships. The authors of the policy brief found 7 key things that they wanted to focus on. Having a commitment to participatory landscape governance is critical. Demonstrating that commitment by actually creating policies at multiple levels and embedding those in how we operate is pretty important. In other words, how can we embed these sort of systems into and help embed and empower and enable these policies to be embedded so that we don't have siloed ministries not working or collaborating together, but otherwise have actual integrated ministry level policies that create local action on the ground. Public policy frameworks that explicitly strengthen landscape partnerships for integrated territorial development. Again, long-term support services responding to locally defined need, strategic coordination among service providers. In other words, initiatives like 1,000 Landscapes, other initiatives like the Foodscapes program by the Nature Conservancy are mostly coalition-based, partnership-based initiatives, and there's very good reason for that, and that we recognize that many of us are working on the same things, and that to actually achieve impact requires a high level of coordination and alignment so that we're not duplicating work, so that we're finding synergies. We work with a lot of different organizations within the 1,000 Landscapes initiative, and one of the best things about working in a partnership-based way is that we're finding that we're working in the same spaces, and we've been working in those spaces in landscapes for decades and haven't known it. So simply just partnering with one another really makes it more obvious to identify where those opportunities to bring together our work is more likely. Proactive engagement of business in landscape partnerships has been a big question for a lot of different actors. How do we get the private sector to actively engage? And not just large corporations, but also SMEs, so that they can have a role in the landscape partnership. Long-term financing for landscape enabling and asset investments. Again, how do we move away from short-term 1, 2-year, even 3-year projects and start thinking about funding for projects and landscapes that's more 10, 20 generational level timeframes. And then lastly, constructive engagement with landscape partnership networks. How do we create the spaces for landscape partnerships and service providers to come together and share learnings? So, how can we actually do these things that I've just laid out? Setting up setting up multi-sector task forces. We're seeing more and more government ministries, organizations, institutions stop setting up specific departments in their institutions for sectors, but moving towards a more integrated model, recognizing that it's a more effective way of working and is better in the long run for the people that they're ultimately trying to support. Identifying and engaging existing landscape and seascape partnerships and businesses that are already actively collaborating in landscape partnerships. So understanding who those are, there's a lot of them out there, and they're not all well documented or within an inventory that we can understand. So knowing who to connect with and who to partner with is quite important. We need to assess government policies, their decision-making structures, and coordination mechanisms related to landscape partnerships and figure out how to leverage those more effectively for partnership, and also so we're aware of who we can provide policy support and service support to. And the same goes for existing institutions, whether it be nonprofits or civil society organizations that are working in this space, and come up with a draft of a strategy for alternative solutions to strengthening landscape partnerships. Strengthen policy and support services for landscape partnerships within a national level landscape dialogues, recognizing that at the national level, there's a lot more shared cultural context, a lot more shared challenges, rather than working at regional or international type levels. So how can we catalyze landscape and territorial policy development? Aligning country strategies, implementing national landscape regeneration programs and new funding to support territorial action, and establishing systems to deploy global climate, food security, and environmental funding on local landscape priorities. So I won't get too much into this because it's been well said already. And I want to give some other people some opportunities to speak so I can stop rambling. But for those who haven't seen it yet, please do download the policy brief. The full report will be coming out within a month or so. It's available, the brief, in both French and English. Please do download it and take a look. And you can reach out to Sarah Shear, one of the primary authors who unfortunately could not be here, the president and CEO of EcoAgriculture Partners. And you can learn more at ecoagriculture.org. And please check out the 1000 Landscapes website at landscapes.global. So with that, thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over now, before we open it up to the broader group, to our group of panelists. Pemo, would you like to moderate? I can moderate. So we have a fantastic group of panelists here today, what we're referring to as dialogue starters, because we would very much like this to be a broader dialogue instead of just more of a traditional Q&A. So I would like to start with Marie-Laure from the UNDP Jeff Small Grants Program and Land Degradation Program Advisor. So Marie-Laure, I'd be curious to know, this is the same question I'll give to all the panelists, what from the policy brief really resonated with you? What recommendations would you have for the authors of the policy brief and also actors operating in this space? And how does it relate to Jeff and the Small Grants Program in particular?
Hi, thank you, Tom. When going through the policy brief, I really thought that the first thing is to share with, thank you, to share with the participants what is actually the UNDP GF Small Grants Program, let's say experience in working with local communities and indigenous people in the landscapes. Because when we interact with civil society organizations, local communities in the landscape, it is important to mention that in the landscape, the partnership that we have there is made of local actors. And the local actors are not only the communities. You also have the local government. You have sometimes private sector. You also have technical service from the different ministries that you can have in the landscape. And also you have those who are, you can consider as people that are external to the landscape, but that can come to the landscape to encroach in the landscape, maybe poachers who are not really stakeholders of the landscape, but who are coming to grab some of the resources in the landscape. These are some of the actors that we have to consider in the landscape. Now, when we go in this landscape, we can see that in SGP experience, we do a participatory assessment of the landscape with most of the actors. to see what are the challenges that mostly the local communities are going through, and now we try to reflect on how to address some of these challenges. I would like to mention here some of the gaps that we think that through the policy we can address, that maybe we have to put a focus on. The first of these is about land tenure. Because in some of the communities, we have this land tenure issue. And the land tenure issue sometimes is vary according to the communities or the countries. In some communities, they can have access, they can be granted access, and they can use the land, but there is no ownership. And ownership is something that the policy can really help to address, because in some areas, local communities can have a concession and do what they want to do with their lands. In some other communities or countries, the lands belong to the state. When the land belongs to the state, the local communities cannot have a certificate of ownership or a land certificate. So anything that they have to do with the lands, there is a barrier. There are barriers for them. So policy can help to address the issue regarding land tenure, because they can grant you access. They can allow you to use, but you are not owning the land. So you cannot really do and build what you want to do with the land, with this land. So in the landscape, we need to help local communities to have the ownership of the land and do what they intend to do for their goods, for the good of humanity, and also for the global environment benefits. A second aspect that I would like to address here is what is related to resources. Civil society organizations or local communities sometimes don't have the skills for resource mobilization. In some countries, local communities cannot have access to loans, maybe to implement what they want to do. For example, having ecotourism projects, they need to build some infrastructure and so on. If they don't have access to loans in the banks or any government scheme in place for them to have resource, is not useful, because they can even have the ownership of the land if they don't have the means. So policy can also help to address these resource mobilization aspects. And the major one is also about building capacities. And capacity building is an area that I think that in our policy brief, we have to make sure that we have a strong point to address, because building capacities of these local actors will really help them to be at the middle of what is going on in the landscape and in the seascapes. And finally, the last thing that I would like to say is that it is important that local communities, indigenous people, are given opportunity to express themselves. It cannot always be informal way of writing and so on. We have also to take into consideration their way of expressing themselves. In some communities, they don't have writing as the main way of communicating. Will we go through video or maybe doing drawings, but we have to also in our policy say how people can be allowed to express themselves. Because indigenous people, some of them, they don't have writing as their main way of communicating. Maybe we can consider having a community assessment of the landscape or saying their needs using video, using drawings, and so on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary-Laure. I completely agree, having a storytelling component or something that gives local landscapes the power to communicate in whatever manner is most effective to them is critical. I'd like to move on to Micah Bourne from ECRAF, an engagement and process specialist for science, practice, and policy. Micah, please.
Shall I use this one?
Try it out, yeah.
Okay, great. Is that loud enough? So I think going through the policy brief, there's quite a few areas that really resonate, but I just wanted to touch on two in particular, which is around the national policy and the learning. So when we're discussing national policy, I think it is of great importance. I'd like to add, in addition to land tenure, that we also look at tree use rights and access. This is often quite separate to land tenure and is also very, very important. Take, for example, Niger, where they brought a presidential decree to increase the use rights to naturally regenerated trees on people's land, for the people that manage the land. National policies are incredibly important, but if they're not implemented, they can stay just sitting there. So I think including within the policy brief an element of ensuring there's focus on implementation and potentially through these landscape networks. In Regreening Africa, one of the approaches that we've taken is to take this decree in Niger, translate it into local languages, and then ensure that it's coming through the radio, that it's coming through local communication, so that people on the ground understand what the policy shift has been. Otherwise, it will just stay at a national level, and it's much harder for it to be implemented. But I think there's also a huge potential for this cross-landscape and cross-country learning around these policy dimensions, particularly where they've been successful. I think there are a number of networks, AFR 100, which is the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiative, the Great Green Wall, and by their nature both sitting under the African Union. These networks have the potential to share across countries, to share across landscapes, and to push for positive shifts in the member countries and in these different landscapes. And I think that there's a lot of potential that we could really make greater use of in that space. The other key area that I wanted to touch briefly on was around the learning. I think it's really important that the brief highlights this need to bring in not just scientific knowledge, but also local knowledge, experience from these different landscape partners, and that is brought together with a really a strong effort on sort of structured learning processes, so that it's not something that's left to chance, but something that is integrated into all of these dialogues, and is something that there is a great effort for. I think there is a lot of data out there that is not used, that is not accessible, and that this is one of the key areas that we need to focus on, is this learning across all evidence sources to inform how we take them forward. So they're my two key additions, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Micah. I'd like to now move on to Brian Cohen, Senior Director of Environment and Climate Change at ACDI Boca. Brian, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks, Tom. So ACDI Boca, as I mentioned before, we are an on-the-ground implementer. Most of the projects that we have we run are based on U.S. government funding, most of which comes from USAID, some USDA, some still further MCC. We also have done some other stuff with other donors, but that's really our sweet spot. We have also, just another plug, I've left some materials as to also the practice areas, what we do at the front of the room. Those practice areas include market systems development, the provision of business development services and catalyzing finance to micro enterprises, small to medium enterprises, nutrition, climate smart agriculture, gender and social inclusion. What I'm going to do, what I'd like to use my time to do, is to zoom in on a project that we've just been awarded by the U.S. government, and then zoom out and just pluck out a few lessons and how they and tie them into the policy brief. We've just won a project in Colombia called the Indigenous Peoples and Afro-Colombians Empowerment Project. This is a large project that's focused on the self-governance of indigenous peoples and Afro-Colombians, livelihood development, particularly with a focus on nature-based solutions, and more specific still, based on biodiversity conservation, income-generating opportunities that conserve biodiversity. The main constituencies with whom our project team will be working are the consejos comunitarios and the resguardos. The consejos comunitarios, or the community councils, are those governing bodies focused on Afro-Colombian populations, focused on areas in which large populations of Afro-Colombians are found. And the resguardos indígenas are those local level governing bodies that are focused on areas where indigenous peoples are found. Together with partner WWF, we will be focusing on environmental management planning for these resguardos and consejos comunitarios, establishing new plans where there are none, strengthening existing plans, assisting with the implementation of landscape management plans, and also assisting in their monitoring. The plans for each of these constituencies are, just to drill down a little bit further, there are obviously existing plans in Colombia, and let me just quickly describe the plan landscape, if you will. At the national level, you have the Programas de Desarrollo con Enfoque Territorial, or in English, development plans with a territorial approach. This is by law decreed that these territorial plans be developed. These plans are 15 years in length, but then further down you have plans that are developed by those local level governance bodies that I mentioned previously. Planes de vida, or life plans, are developed by the indigenous resguardos, and the planes de etno desarrollo or ethnic development plans are those plans that are developed by the Afro-Colombian communities, the consejos comunitarios. Now, this is just the beginning of the project, but if we can, we've already begun to identify some of the needs, some of the challenges. Oftentimes, these PDETs, or the Programas de Desarrollo con Enfoque Territorial, the PDETs, the large territorial plans issued by the government for 15 years, so they oftentimes are not designed. So in some parts of Colombia, you just don't have them. In other parts of Colombia, you might have the PDET, you might have the plan, but because there's so many moving parts, some parts of the plan are financed, have funding for their realization, and other parts of the plan do not have the requisite financing for implementation. Oftentimes also the PDETs, in theory, these PDETs, these national plans, should be including private sector. They should be including civil society, CSOs. In fact, oftentimes you read one, and they do include, the writing is in there, but in practice, unfortunately, all too often private sector is not really engaged in the implementation of these territorial plans, nor is civil society really truly engaged. That's another big need. The other thing I think is kind of this standout observation at the beginning of this project is that the large PDET and the smaller planes de vida by the indigenous groups and the planes de etno desarrollo by the Afro-Colombians, they do not look at each other. They are not integrated. In designing these lower level landscape plans, oftentimes they don't take into consideration the policy opportunities or frameworks presented by the PDETs, and vice versa. The PDETs also sort of are a bit blind with regard to these lower level landscape plans. Yeah, I think my last point, I think, is that in their implementation, the implementation of the Planes de Vida and the Afro-Colombian plans, there's a great need for teasing out or thinking about their implementation. What's it going to take to implement these plans? Strengthening institutions, I think, strengthening local level institutions, strengthening in particular the consejos comunitarios and the resguardos, I think is top of the list. And if I then should zoom out again and looking at the policy brief, I can say check, 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 check. All of these things that the policy brief includes, supportive government policies, technical services and local capacity development, it goes to the issue of capacity strengthening, institutional strengthening, financial business services, we need the financing and the funding, and the connections for knowledge. The importance of making the space, as Tom had mentioned in his introduction, making the space for coordination between these various constituencies, I think, is vital. So there's a lot to do, but I think this policy brief is a step in the right direction in framing the needs and the opportunities. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and very much agree that there's a need for recognizing what plans already exist and how to make those existing plans more inclusive and those actors who are not included a part of the process. So I'd like to hand it over to our last panelist, Louise Baker of the Global Mechanism, who is the managing director of the Global Mechanism for the UNCCD. So Louise, over to you. Thank you.
Great to be here. In the role in the Global Mechanism, my job really is about mobilizing resources for the parties in different formats. And so I really focus, I think, in looking, if I get much closer, it's going to be right on my nose. Okay.
Do you want to try the microphone?
No, it's okay. Well, if it resonates, everybody jump back, okay?
Okay.
I guarantee nothing. So we're really seeing, in terms of the setting of the LDN targets, an increasing demand for multi-country projects and landscape projects, which I think is great. We think multi-country projects in particular, largely because it's seen to be as a method for mobilizing more resources, actually. You put the same amount of effort into a project for one country as you do for 5, and 5 countries 5 times more money. That's pretty much the theory. And to a certain extent, it works. So things like the Great Green Wall generate the kind of political movement and excitement from people that means that more money does flow. We've got demand particularly emerging at watershed level, which I think is really interesting for UNCCD because it's the land-water nexus issue, and I think really offers an opportunity to manage land and water together for the benefit of the entire landscape. Working on some exciting projects in the Zambezi water course and exploring things in the dry corridor in Central America as well. But these type of multi-country landscape projects, they do face some challenges. Oh yes. Coordination is very high amongst them. So it might make ecological sense to do this, and actually practical sense, programmatic sense is absolutely on point. But our institutions are set up so that you have to access money through the current jurisdictional structure. So if I do a multi-country project in the Zambezi, I need 8 countries to sign off on this. I need 8 ministers of environment and 8 ministers of finance to do this work. It's like trying to herd cats to get everybody moving in the same direction. So that's very definitely it's very definitely a challenge. I think it's worth doing, and we're kind of investing at that sort of scale, but it is something that is not easy. So I think these jurisdictional issues, because the landscape cuts across, whether that's cutting across local county boundaries or national boundaries, these jurisdictional issues are a thing. In terms of coordination in the first instance, in terms of actually what we're finding is lump them together. Taxes, subsidies, and incentives are very, very different in different parts of the landscape. So, with all the best will in the world, if one part of the landscape is particularly incentivized for a certain type of activity, then it kind of skews the overall plan. Laws and standards and infrastructure also not at the same level across the landscape quite often. So I think it requires some mental gymnastics that I'm not sure that the political leaders have quite got to yet. There's a willingness to think about it. It's not that people don't recognize the benefits of this, but it's definitely a work in progress. I think this also, in terms of what the policy brief talks about in terms of private sector, is also something that's attracting private sector finance is also limited by this incentives and kind of attractiveness of the parts of the landscape. My feeling is that actually might be one of the more interesting things, though, that you could work at a landscape level to incentivize private investment and give the right market signals at the landscape level. I actually think it's probably easier to do that than rearrange public financing almost. So that's something I think is worth exploring. The other piece that we're doing is obviously land degradation neutrality, and increasingly understanding that the land degradation neutrality targets have been set at national level. They are of mixed quality. Some are fabulous, some are useless. And some don't really drive the policy agenda forward. And I think what we're trying to do now with actually a JEF project enabling environment activity that will start very soon, is looking at this integrated land use planning aspects, especially looking at the relationship between the geospatially specific aspects of planning with the targets. So kind of really set the kind of plans for restoration, sustainable management within the landscape rather than as a sort of philosophical concept. So yeah, I think my interest really is obviously I think it was number 6 in the policy brief about the financing, and I would be really interested to follow up on both the coordination aspects and also the taxes, subsidies and incentives for private investment at that level. I think it's an exciting area of opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. That was fantastic, and happy to follow up. The coordination piece and the financing for it is quite critical. So thanks again to all of our panelists. And like I said, we're hoping that this is just a dialogue starter. This is very much the beginning of the conversation. And there's going to be tons of follow-up work to make this white paper more than just a white paper, but transition it to action and implement some of these recommendations from the authors and also recommendations from the many, many experts and landscape leaders that we talk to, and how we can embed these recommendations into how we operate and how we can influence decision makers and people that pull the levers, how they can implement these recommendations into their own sort of mechanisms for operating. So with that, we have about a half hour remaining in this session. I would like to hand it over to anyone in the audience who has a question. Please feel free to raise your hand or actually just speak up and use your microphone. So, Bob, please.
I guess mine is more a comment than a question. Thank you very much for this great work. It's a very important contribution that many people can build on. And I'd like to talk very briefly about this kind of work from the standpoint of agriculture. Can you still hear me? Okay. And I do want to note that a couple of other processes are yielding support for this type of policy effort. So for example, in the CBD process, there's discussions for biodiversity financing plans. And the kind of work, the policy work that you're talking about here, we're talking about here, well, a lot of it is in favor of biodiversity. Then coming out of the Food Systems Summit last year, we've seen the UN agencies come together around a financial mechanism to help small producers get over the transition to practices that work better for people and for nature. Again, seems like a very close correlation on the policy side with what's in the brief and what's been presented and discussed. The Nature Conservancy, as a biodiversity conservation organization, has committed to agriculture, to food and water, in order to further our own mission. I think the importance of that is known to everyone here. And so we're looking to see what we can do for agricultural systems or food systems transformation. And as Louise noted, it's very powerful if we can create partnerships at scale, and together with Louise and the leadership and other great friends and personnel of the UNCCD, we've been talking this week here about potentially a collaboration across West Africa. I appreciate Louise's wise comments. Also makes me think, are there stepwise ways that you can build something over time while you're cultivating the 8 or 10 or 13 ministers and so on. And actually, there's an obvious logic to it because we are in West Africa and there is an Abidjan Legacy Program, but it was actually the Jeff lead for restoration who said, why not West Africa for those reasons? You know, building on top of or out from the Abidjan Legacy Program, and there are other things going on, an emerging Sahel project supported by the Green Climate Fund, the famously well-known Great Green Wall project. So there are other individual efforts, including by my friend and his colleagues from ACDI VOCA in the region. And if you do get the Jeff or the Green Climate Fund to step in, well, it creates an additional organizing platform. But I wanted to mention very briefly what Tom mentioned about us and the idea of foodscapes. So a foodscape could be a landscape, part of a landscape, but it also could be a place where you create a compelling vision, and those who are part of that dialogue can say to the policymakers, these are the changes that are needed in law, policy, regulation, subsidies and other financing, extension and other services to help us all get to the vision that we would like to see. So sometimes global policy can be hard. Sometimes national policy can be hard, almost all the time for both. But maybe if at the landscape or the foodscape it's compelling for people and for the natural environment, that may make it more actionable for the decision makers. Thank you for allowing me to share.
No, thank you, Bob. I wonder, not to put you on the spot, but Patrick, with your experience in the Great Green Wall, it seems pretty relevant to the conversation today in terms of some of the things Louise was touching on for cross-country coordination and collaboration in terms of getting that level of cooperation where there is a lot of shared learnings to be had, but also a lot of cultural and context diversity in the space. I wonder if you could just briefly talk about some of the challenges that you face from a policy perspective in incorporating this cross-cutting sort of thing into the Great Green Wall program.
Thank you. As I said earlier, this is my first time in this forum. It's quite a learning process, but having listened to the presentations and the comments, at the community level, cooperation and partnership are quite easy because the community tends to agree on what is their priorities. The community tends to agree on what is their priorities. But at times, at the other multi-stakeholder level, there could be overlaps. Overlap, for example, agriculture will tell you, I'm supposed to do this. Water resources will say, oh, that is my job. Then the environment man will say, oh, I'm supposed to do this. So somehow, at a certain level, there could be this conflict of overlaps. It can even lead to complacency. Okay, you've taken over my job, just go on. So I want to see a situation where these policy briefs, this engagement at the landscape situations, we can find a way to harmonize this semi-conflict overlap of interest and activity. But essentially, each community for a particular landscape tend to agree on their needs and on their priority. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. No, it's good to hear that there's that alignment on the local level for sure, and there's action to be had. I wonder if I could ask some of my friends from Rainforest Alliance to please go ahead.
Thank you, Tom. I want to pose some challenges and, of course, a question. Probably, I consider myself young and a beginner in landscape fronts. I'm just wondering, following up from what my brothers just mentioned, do we have like tested models of engaging stakeholders in such partnerships that have successfully worked that can be copied and upscaled or replicated? I'm asking this because, like I mentioned, I'm young in the landscapes front, and we're developing a landscape kind of program in Kenya. And from the initial stages, I know there is the issue of doing research and collecting data, getting the common issues that people need to address. You come together, look at the common things that need to be addressed. But again, in those arrangements, you find changing priorities, for example, with organizations and partners. And like the other day, one partner wrote to me and said, we now have a new board, and the strategy and the vision does not align with this program, so we are pulling out. And I'm like, what? We've moved all this along, and you are telling me the vision has now changed because you have a new board, so what do we do from here? And I mean, like, do we have, successful models, for example, how to engage, these partnerships, or is just a matter of politics and managing, partnerships and trying to persuade and all that until probably an end of it? I heard yesterday there are people who run 10 years programs. Amazing. Mine is just 5, and I'm already seeing fire. It has not even started in implementation of activities. And the other thing is, do we also have an example, for example, of a successful model where, for example, I mentioned another forum yesterday that in such landscape projects, the initial stages, they are funded by a donor, and you have resources to, hold workshops, bring people together, exchange and all that. But at the end of that funding, do we have an example of a successful continuation of financing where the stakeholders probably contribute, some, governments come in and support so that there's continuity of such interventions without necessarily donors or other donors coming on board? Just curious. Thanks.
Can I jump in on that? I find that a really fascinating question, in that I think right from the beginning, when we set up the restoration programs, when we think about how we're going to work within a landscape, within a project, the long-term viability of the project has got to be built in. And external resources are never reliable, in my opinion. Has to be internal resources, either from the population there or because we make it a viable product or a viable space, either for tourism, or we're growing something and we're selling it, or there's some sort of self-regulating internal market that doesn't need any external things. And I think it's something that we don't do systematically. We think about it in terms of it's really a challenge for our team as well, that we look to go and get money from GCF or from a donor, and we have all this very exciting environmental restoration piece going on, but we don't think about building the long-term economic success or the long-term success of the communities or the ecosystem. I think it has to be systematic, right from the beginning, right even when we've got donor funding, we have to be thinking about after. And I don't think we do it enough. I agree with you totally.
Can I come in on that, Tom? And yeah, just to continue on what Louise is saying, and to say it takes time. It takes a lot of investment of time and resources. I have an experience with river basin organizations in Southern Africa that have actually a fantastic model that has been developed and implemented over more than 2 decades that we're now only starting to see the benefits of. Of course, this is a multi-country level, which is something that probably an initiative like the Great Green Wall could take lessons out of, where countries on their own come together and recognize the benefit of cooperative governance of a shared resource and agree to put in place the policy infrastructure, if you like, agree on a constitution at the highest level of governments in these countries, put in place an institutional mechanism for, discussing issues on a, maybe twice a year, where they discuss the details of understanding the issue they're dealing with. For instance, this with the support of Jeff financing over a long time and bilateral donors, they've undertaken this 3-phase sort of approach where first they invest in understanding the basin in this context. So they carry out what they call diagnostic analysis of the basin. They understand the ecology of it, the hydrology of it, everything, social systems that are present in the basin, and document this and find the challenges and opportunities for cooperative governance to the lowest level of governance in these contexts. Then they move from understanding the resource to then planning on how to manage the resource. So they do strategic action programs that look at how you're going to manage the water, how you're going to manage the soil, how you're going to manage the forests, the wildlife, the economic activities that are attached to these natural resources, if it's ecotourism or agricultural development, or there's mining happening, so managing these competing land uses such that the impacts on the resource are minimized and the benefits are maximized. And of course, they agree on benefit sharing mechanisms to ensure that a country upstream, what it does on the river does not impact too negatively on the country on the downstream level. And if there are impacts, what are the compensation mechanisms there if they can be agreed? And then that phase then moves, once they have agreed on the strategic action planning, they move to the investment planning stage, where they identify opportunities for generating income. It could be from, for example, if it's a river that has the potential for generating hydropower, they could invest in hydropower generation. Of course, to power their own countries, but also potentially to even sell this at a premium. And this is what Louise is talking about. Getting to that stage where there is self-sustenance in the management of the landscape or ecosystem or resource that is being shared. Ecotourism. I come from Botswana, and Botswana is downstream of the Okavango River. And in the Botswana part, it's the Okavango Delta, which is important for the tourism industry of Botswana, which is the second largest contributor to the GDP. Lots of jobs attached to this, as you can imagine. So if Angola on the upstream side is looking at putting a dam on the Okavango River, you can imagine what happens downstream to Namibia, which depends on the river for agriculture and tourism, and to Botswana, that depends almost entirely for its tourism income on this resource. So that cooperative governance of agreeing, sitting down for years, more than 2 decades in this case, of coming to a point where you have a collaborative governance system that facilitates this collaborative planning and investments and benefit sharing mechanisms that ensure that everybody on the basin utilizing this resource sees the benefit of actually cooperating in its sustainable management. So this is something that I think it's difficult, and it requires a lot of investment of time and money, but it can work. It has worked in some places. Of course, with climate change, introducing new challenges of, droughts. Imagine if you are depending on a river system and it's affected by drought for years. There's massive implications on economies and communities living in these landscapes. But these kinds of mechanisms can actually be resilient against these types of challenges. Then they can be sort of cooperative solutions, like collaborative solutions to addressing problems, even those that are presented by climate change. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Let me just chime in really quickly on this interesting topic of conversation that Michael sparked. So in terms of, it does seem to me, just generally speaking, that the conservation community, development community, we are increasingly moving toward thinking from the farm level about interventions at the farm level to the landscape level. So we're sort of increasing our thinking sort of on a from a geographic point of view, if you like. We're also increasing our thinking or expanding our thinking on along temporal lines as well, realizing, of course, that within a 5-year project you can do only so much, and then the question becomes what happens after. I think there have been some workarounds or some interesting things that USAID has done. I can speak from that experience, being from a USAID contracting background. In terms of layering or sequencing projects, similar to what Pema was saying, that other funding institutions are doing, sequencing programs sort of back to back in such a way that maybe one program is focused on one aspect for the first 5 years, following 5 years, another aspect. And so there is some sort of continuity achieved. I'm not sure that we around this table are going to be able to, crack that nut or convince the politicians to increase the funding cycles from 5 to 10 or 15 years. It's not going to happen. But I think there are some workarounds that USAID's been doing on that. The other point on what we can do in this regard, I think was raised by Louise in terms of thinking about how we design the project in the 5 years. This is something that ACDI VOCA is doing by putting a lot of attention on getting SMEs investment ready. So a lot of the work that we do in years 1 to 3, 1 to 4 of a project is about incubation of good ideas, experimentation, and then trying to then sell those ideas or sell those enterprises and attract and serve as honest broker in attracting financing, whether it's from within the country or outside of that country, to come in so that the actions that we've sort of helped to nudge along continue beyond the life of the project. So that's just a period after that point, a line under that. The other point the other thought I wanted to come back to was one that Tom, you had mentioned in your presentation about the importance of partnerships among CSOs, NGOs, research institutions. We need to be doing a better job of working together, and that is, RA and TNC and EcoAgriculture's UNDP and so on, and us and everybody else. We have to do a better job of working together. This is also something I think that was underscored by Louise. I'm sorry she left, but Louise had made the point about the benefits, potential benefits of multi-country programs, but then also recognizing the challenges of multi-country programs in their coordination, herding cats, this kind of a thing. But I do think that it's a necessity to really double down on this importance of coordination among partners. Speaking of one of USAID's longest running investment in conservation, in regional conservation, is a program called CARPE in Central Africa, regional program on the environment, over 10, 15 years running still. But this is a program in which WWF, WRI, AWF, a number of different actors had programs and projects in different areas of Central Africa, and it was almost like, it was a lot of really good things. There are a lot of really good things about this program, but one of the challenges was it was almost like the balkanization of Central Africa. Over here you had AWF and their programs. Over here you had CI and their programs, and so on and so forth. And never the twain shall meet. There were real challenges in terms of sharing of information between the partners and so on. So I think that, if we are really intent on selling this idea of landscape conservation, we have to do a better job of coming together ourselves to coordinate, in the ideascape, if you like, not landscape, but the ideascape people, these groups that we represent. We have to, after all, if we can't do it, if we are stovepiped and the ACDI VOCA is here and so on, then how can we expect that this concept is really going to take root of landscape level change and management? So I think that we got to do a better job of walking the walk, and I think that starts there, forming good partnerships, and that's why 1,000 Landscapes is so very great.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to, we have about 10 minutes. Kwando, please.
Thank you very much, Tom. So what I want to add to the discussion is the issue of ownership. And I think Marie earlier touched on it. And to me, after implementing projects for some time, I have seen ownership as a key issue. In most cases, when organizations are awarded projects, we normally don't define the time when we have to lead and then give the ownership to a governance structure or even any model that we are building up. In most cases, we begin leading until the end of the project. If you are instituting a governance structure or anything that has to do with a board, you would have to realize that your sustainability plan will include that after the project, these local people are going to be on their own. What capacity are you giving to them such that when you are no longer in the helm of affairs, these locals can continue
But in most cases, we forget our role as facilitators, and then we lead until the project ends. So when we are out, obviously, no matter how strong the structure is, it's going to collapse. Michael asked a question of revenue. So our role as implementers would first have to identify these revenue sources and then help these locals to now implement it. Be at the back and then try to see and then guide them. But we still take the lead until the 5 years, the 10 years is up, and then we expect them to, I don't think that will win. A case that I can cite from Ghana, it's as part of Rainforest Alliance activities in one of the districts called Dwabosobia. I can tell you that after 10 years, when we had left them, these guys are still operating. They still get revenue from the sources that we had given them, and it's helping them. So I think what I would advise is that we should find ourselves as facilitators, have a plan as to when we will pull back, and then ensure that the structure continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwadwo. I want to thank Michael for sparking that great dialogue, and to all the people that responded to it. I just want to touch on a few points and reiterate some things. Louise's point on making sure that internal resources are really the drivers of these processes is really important. So it's fantastic when we can get some external funding to catalyze a process at a landscape level, whether that is for convening or coordinating operations, or even for traditional project-based funding is usually a great entry point, or can be a great entry point for starting up a greater landscape project. What makes that really sustainable, though, is ensuring that those internal resources are there and generated, so that the community who generated those internal resources are a part of the process and can really make sure it's driving home sustainability for the long haul. On Brian's point of organizing ourselves as actors in this space, acting internationally, we very much need to practice the ideals that we preach in terms of operating ourselves very much like a landscape partnership, a multi-stakeholder coalition where we have a diversity of perspectives and a diversity of values. And this isn't necessarily meant to be a really friendly sort of way of operating. There's going to be inherent tensions when it comes to working together based on grants that we have always been competing for and differences in opinions. But we all recognize that the goals we're trying to achieve are ambitious and audacious enough that without working together, there really is no hope of achieving them. So 1,000 Landscapes for 1 billion people was very much set up to be a globally scaled landscape partnership. In other words, we're meant to operate how we would like to see a landscape partnership operate. And that requires coordination and convening. Brian had mentioned that within, there isn't necessarily coordination across our organizations. To take that a step further, we often see with larger and even smaller organizations that coordination is lacking internally within our organizations. And that's something we really need to grapple with in terms of how are we connecting the dots between the programs within our own organizations. Every bigger organizations and institutions, whether it's a research institution or a civil society, all have many, many different projects and individuals working on those projects who are very passionate about them or competing for resources internally. Coordination needs to happen at the organizational level, cross-organizational level, nationally, across governments, internationally, and making sure that we save funding, financing, and time to have space and resources to make sure that we're putting adequate attention on coordination and convening is really, really important, and is something that traditionally has not been there that we hope to see happening more and more. In the last 5 minutes here, I just want to touch on an interesting case study on a recent trip to the Choco Andino landscape of Ecuador. The 1,000 Landscapes Partners had the privilege of a couple weeks ago having our first in-person convening in Ecuador. And Ecuador is a really fascinating country in that they have a rights for nature policy embedded in their constitution, which was really groundbreaking. And what it has done is it has created a tool that local communities can use that empowers them to make sure that nature is being protected and that therefore it's providing communities with the ecosystem services that it's supposed to have. What that has done is incentivize private sector actors and governments and communities to actually cooperate with one another, recognizing that the tool is the constitutional amendment. And the Constitution Amendment alone isn't enough to actually create that cooperation, but it just empowers and enables it. So it's a really impactful sort of policy and a strong case study that can be replicated in many other places. So with that, I want to make sure we end on time here, and I also want to emphasize the fact that we have coffee and some refreshments that I implore everyone to take advantage of. And I want to thank everyone again for joining us on 9 a.m. at Saturday morning at the end of a long, long week. I hope to see many of you at the next session about a half an hour from now, starting at 11:30 in Met 14 on 1,000 Landscapes for 1 billion people. And again, what's that? We're in Met 14 now, aren't we? Sorry, I apologize. I've been doing this nonstop, and all of you must hate me for all the confusion I've been creating. So I see a hand, please.
I'm really sorry, but we do have at 11:30 here a side event on human mobility, restorative practices and labor migration. I'm from IOM. If anyone wants to stay, you are more than welcome. Sorry for that.
This is just a friendly competition between side events. This is, speaking of the need to coordinate, we should probably just think about, having events take place in just one big space instead of siloing and creating these sectors. But maybe that's something we can all do our part to recommend to the COP. So again, thank you everyone. Thanks to the panelists and everyone who presented. Please.
Okay, thank you so much. It's really a good pleasure for me to meet one more EcoAgriculture here, because I get a certificate at Smithsonian University with EcoAgriculture. But now we are working on youth and land access, and we have a platform of e-learning for the young people in Africa. So I want to know if we have possibility to integrate your materials, your course materials, to help more young people in Africa to learn more about the module that you have on your platform. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I implore you to join us for the next session where we'll be talking about exactly that. So we'll see you there, and thanks everyone. Hope to see you around and continue this conversation.